Have you ever wondered if silence itself could kill you, if a place so quiet exists, that every secret ever spoken there has been swallowed forever? And if behind those quiet walls, something older than faith still waits in the dark? Because in the autumn of 1847, the stone convent at Hollow Creek appeared no different from any other house of devotion rising on the fringes of Ohio's low fields, its whitewashed walls glimmering like bone beneath the bare trees, and its slender chapel spire catching the first cold light of dawn. But for those travelers brave or foolish enough to pass along the rutted road that skirted its grounds, it was whispered that this building held a hush that went deeper than mere quiet, an atmosphere so heavy with secrets that even the wind seemed reluctant to touch its stones. Some called it one of the haunted places you've never heard of. Others murmured that its silence was a veil stretched over dark history and unsolved mysteries too terrible for daylight. No bells rang to mark the hours, no singing spilled over the hedge to reassure the weary. Instead, on certain mornings before the fog lifted, a thin procession of veiled women might be glimpsed pacing the inner courtyard, moving in slow, deliberate unison, as if compelled by a rhythm no human ear could hear. They were the Sisters of Hollow Creek, a convent of merely 11 women who had long abandoned ordinary ritual, embracing instead a discipline whose true purpose was never written down, and whose rules, if asked, drew only a shaken head from the village priest, unwilling or unable to speak of what lay beyond the cloister wall. But there was one document hidden like a thorn among dusty county ledgers that offered the faintest glimpse into this convent's forbidden order. It recorded a delivery in the frozen winter of 1849, a consignment of wax so vast it demanded 3 wagons to carry it through snow-choked roads. The invoice bore the name of Mother Lorette the Abbess, whose identity appeared nowhere else in church records, whose origins were a blank space in every ledger. The wax was pale as sweet, exuding a sour smell of tallow, grown soft with age, and no living soul could explain why a convent of 11 women would require hundreds of pounds of it, nor why the abbess demanded it be borne by hand into a sealed cellar beneath the chapel, a door bolted afterward and never opened again. Even today, this is counted among America's most disturbing secrets, and real horror stories whispered by paranormal investigators and lovers of creepy legends who suspect that Hollow Creek might be the scariest place no one talks about. A true horror, hiding not in shrieks or shadows, but in the hush where even God's name dares not echo. What if I told you that silence can be more deadly than screams, that there's a place in America where words themselves have been outlawed for over a century, and that behind its white walls lies one of the most chilling, unsolved mysteries ever hidden from the history books? In the crisp breath of autumn 1847, there stood the stone convent of Hollow Creek, rising from Ohio's low flat fields like a vision both sacred and somehow wrong. Its whitewashed walls luminous against the bare trees and its chapel spire lifting skyward to catch the first fragile light of dawn. From a distance, it might have seemed like any house of devotion, serene and devout, but for those who dared the rutted road winding past its gates, there lingered a hush deeper than quiet, an invisible weight pressing into the air, hinting at dark secrets too heavy for any sermon. Locals spoke in murmurs, some calling it one of America's haunted places. You've never heard of a site where the stones seemed to absorb prayers, and where real horror stories waited to be exhaled in the dark. No bells rang to mark the hours, no gentle hymns floated beyond the hedgerows to soothe restless hearts. Instead, the convent appeared to breathe its own silence, as though it demanded secrecy as payment for every glimpse behind its pale walls. It was a place that slipped past the pages of official chronicles, buried under layers of hidden history and rumors of rituals so private that even the priest who served the village church would only lower his gaze and shake his head when pressed for answers. "You don't want to know what's beyond those walls," some whispered, and in that single trembling sentence lay the seed of countless creepy true stories and forgotten legends that still curl like fog through Ohio's empty fields, waiting for the next soul reckless enough to look closer. Imagine a place so devoted to secrecy that even prayers have been silenced, where devotion has twisted into something older and more absolute, and where every breath carries the weight of unspeakable vows, a place whispered about among the darkest corners of true horror communities, and counted among the real haunted places you're not supposed to visit. Because within the stone walls of Hollow Creek in the waning months of 1847, something profoundly unnatural had begun to take root, weaving itself through every shadow and every breath until even time seemed to lose its power there. The convent was no longer a place where bells rang to mark the gentle hours, or where hymns rose to soothe the weary. Instead, a silence had wrapped itself around the building like a second skin, thick enough to smother the echo of a footstep, or the brush of wind across the eaves. The sisters who dwelled within no longer appeared in the village streets, no longer joined harvest processions, and no longer knelt at the altar to accept the sacraments before the eyes of God and neighbor alike. No songs drifted over the hedge, no laughter spilled from open windows, no glimpse of life escaped the veil of hush that hung perpetually over those pale stones. And when curious travelers tried to learn why the village priest would only lower his eyes and shake his head, murmuring that some truths were too heavy for mortal tongues, as though he feared that speaking them aloud might tear the very fabric of his faith. It was said that the Sisters of Hollow Creek had abandoned every ritual known to the church, replacing them with a discipline so absolute that it had never been written down nor dared be spoken. In the language of modern storytellers, it has become one of history's most unsolved mysteries, a dark secret lurking behind Ohio's quiet fields, a place whose legend endures in videos and whispers, fueling countless reels and shorts dedicated to creepy legends and disturbing secrets buried under layers of hidden history. And yet, for all its viral fame among those who chase the real horror story, there remains so much no footage has ever captured, no script has ever fully told. Because Hollow Creek is not merely haunted, it's a wound in the world where silence has become law and where even God's name dares not echo. On certain mornings before the fog surrendered to the sun, veiled figures could sometimes be glimpsed moving across the inner courtyard, their steps measured and eerily synchronized, as if obeying a rhythm that no human ear could ever hear. It was the kind of sight that might seem almost beautiful if not for the unshakable sense that each woman was walking towards something she could never return from. And in that hush, in that suffocating quiet, the true horror lay hidden not in screams or shadows, but in the realization that here was faith so inward it had ceased to require witnesses at all. The convent of Hollow Creek was becoming not merely a house of worship, but a fortress of silence, its secrets sealed behind walls that seemed to breathe with a life of their own. And somewhere inside those walls, unseen, unnamed, pulsed a truth so harrowing that every traveler who dared linger near its gates found themselves haunted by the same question. What exactly had the Sisters of Hollow Creek chosen to worship instead of the God who once heard their voices? Some mysteries are whispered through generations, hiding in dusty ledgers and forgotten archives, but others live like a splinter under the skin of history, refusing to be ignored and daring the world to ask, why would a convent of 11 silent women need enough wax to drown a man? For in a single fragile record scrawled by a county clerk whose handwriting trembled across the yellowed page, there survives the only official glimpse into the hidden life of Hollow Creek, a trace of a secret that would go on to haunt generations of locals, historians, and modern seekers of real horror stories. It spoke of a winter in 1849, so bitter that the rivers froze solid and wagon wheels cracked beneath the weight of ice, a season when the convent, hidden away from the eyes of the village, submitted an order so massive it required 3 wagons to deliver. The cargo was wax, hundreds upon hundreds of pounds of it, pale as sweet slick with a faint sour odor, like old tallow softening under forgotten heat. The invoice bore the signature of Mother Lorette, a name that appeared nowhere else in the ledgers of the church or the county, as if she had stepped into existence only to sign that paper and then vanished back into the hush. And here's where the chill seeps deeper. No one could explain why a convent of 11 women cloistered from the world would require such a monstrous weight of wax, or why the abbess demanded it be carried by hand, crate by crate, into a sealed cellar beneath the chapel, a door bolted afterward, and never opened again. Some today call it one of America's most unsolved mysteries, a chapter in the book of dark secrets that even paranormal documentaries fear to touch, because its silence seems to reach out from the past and wrap around the throat of anyone who dares ask too many questions. Why wax? The question hovers like breath in the frozen air, a detail that refuses to fade, because in that single consignment lies a terror that cannot quite be named. Carters hired for the delivery would later recall the way the sisters waited in the courtyard as the wagons pulled in, each figure, robed in heavy cloth, faces lowered, pressing narrow strips of linen to their lips, as if to muffle a cry no mortal ear was meant to hear. One man said he felt the weight of their silence like a hand closing around his spine. And though no words were spoken, He claimed it was the first time in his life he understood true horror. A horror born not of monsters or blood, but of devotion twisted so tight it threatened to snap. And when the last crate vanished into darkness, the cellar door slammed shut, the iron bolt sliding into place with a sound that rang like a coffin nail. No one would ever see inside that room again. It became, even in its own time, a forbidden ritual hidden beneath the hush of prayer, a detail whispered in saloons and churchyards, growing over the decades into one of America's most disturbing secrets, a place you're not supposed to visit, and a story that chills even the modern age of digital sleuths and YouTube thrill seekers. Because in the quiet of Hollow Creek there are some truths so monstrous that the only way to survive them is never to speak them aloud. There are stories so eerie that no matter how many times you hear them, they still send a chill along your spine. And one of those stories begins with 11 silent women standing in the frost, their mouths hidden behind strips of cloth, as if guarding a sound the world was never meant to hear. For the Carters hired that bitter winter of 1849. The delivery to Hollow Creek seemed at first like any other backbreaking job, just a consignment of heavy crates rattling in the wagon bed wheels, biting deep into the ruts of frozen earth. But as the convent gates swung open, a hush fell so absolute that even the creaking axles seemed an affront to the silence gathered beneath those pale stone walls. The sisters emerged into the courtyard in single file, each figure slender and robed in the severe habit of their order, and though the sun glared off the snow, the shadows seemed to cling unnaturally to the folds of their garments. No faces were visible, for every nun kept her head bowed, pressing a narrow strip of linen across her lips, a gesture that struck the Carters as both reverence and warning, as though each woman was struggling to hold back some secret cry that could shatter the brittle winter air. One of the men would later confess that he felt as though 1,000 invisible eyes were watching him from behind those veils, and he swore he heard the faintest rhythmic murmur pulsing beneath the hush, a sound like breath forced through sealed mouths. And in that moment, he understood that this delivery was no mere cargo, but something far more terrifying, a chapter in what modern thrill seekers now call real horror stories, and unsolved mysteries that refuse to die. One crate after another was lifted from the wagons, the wax inside pale and waxy soft, exuding a faint sour scent like tallow grown old in hidden cellars. The abbess Mother Lorette supervised the process from the shadows, her presence somehow more chilling for being so still, and she offered no word of thanks or blessing. Instead, she simply gestured toward the narrow door that led beneath the chapel, a door so ancient that iron flakes crumbled under the touch. The Carters carried each crate into the darkness, muscles trembling under the weight, until at last the final box vanished below, swallowed by the silence. Then, with a final metallic groan, the cellar door was dragged shut, and the heavy bolt slammed into place, the echo ringing like a hammer striking the lid of a coffin. From that instant onward, no man ever laid eyes on that hidden room again, and though many have tried to unravel what lay behind those stones, the answer has remained locked away among the world's most disturbing secrets, a secret so potent that even whispers of it linger today among believers in creepy true stories and seekers of hidden history. For in Hollow Creek, it was never the shadows themselves that terrified men most, it was the silence heavy and watchful, pressing against every wall like a breath waiting to speak. And in that hush lay the most chilling truth of all. Whatever the sisters of Hollow Creek were hiding, it was something they believed the world could not survive hearing. There are places in this world whose silence grows so deep it begins to breed legends. Places whose hush becomes the raw material for nightmares and nursery rhymes alike. And Hollow Creek is one of those places, a name whispered in the same breath as the world's most haunted places and unsolved mysteries. Because when the last crate of pale wax disappeared into the blackness beneath the chapel floor, and the iron bolt slammed shut with a finality that seemed to echo through the convent stones, something shifted in the soil of Hollow Creek, as though the earth itself shivered to seal the secret. From that moment on, the convent became a cautionary tale repeated by parents who wanted restless children to sleep. They spoke in hushed voices of the silent sisters who moved behind curtained windows, never glimpsed except in the hour before dawn. They warned that to linger too close was to risk seeing something your mind might never recover from, a glimpse of faith, turned inside out of devotion, twisted into shapes the church had no name for. And though generations have passed, the stories have refused to die. Travelers who lost their way at night claim to see candlelight flickering behind the upper shutters of Hollow Creek, the glow of dozens of tapers casting trembling silhouettes along the pale plaster walls. And in those shifting lights, they insisted could be seen. Figures knelt in postures so rigid, so contorted, that no one could believe they were merely women at prayer. Some swore that arms bent at impossible angles, that spines arched as though under a burden unseen, and that shadows seemed to ripple in patterns like writing scratched across a wall conveying messages in a language no one dared translate. One man, a drover from Cleveland, would later say the sight robbed him of sleep for years, because in that fleeting vision he felt he was not merely an intruder, but a witness to a forbidden ritual, a fragment of a story the world was never meant to finish reading. They weren't praying, he whispered to anyone who would listen. They were becoming something else. And it's for that single confession that modern researchers still comb through the convent story, hoping to crack open one of America's most dark secrets, hunting for clues to one of the most creepy legends ever whispered among the hidden chapters of real haunted places. For in the hush of Hollow Creek, there lies a horror that thrives not on screams, but on the terrifying possibility that faith itself can be transformed into something monstrous. The village priest, when confronted yet again by fearful parishioners desperate for answers, would only quote scripture about the perils of questioning God's chosen, and then fall silent as if some truth sat lodged in his throat like a splinter. And still the stories persisted, carried from lips to ears, gathering new details, with every retelling growing into a tale that would come to haunt not just Ohio, but every corner of the world, enthralled by the question, what devotion could possibly demand such silence? And what price did the sisters pay for choosing it? Pause for just a moment and ask yourself this. How many secrets might be lurking in the places you pass every day, disguised behind walls that look ordinary, until the hush presses in and makes you question if reality is as solid as it seems? Before we go any further into this tale of Hollow Creek, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it where you are right now? Drop it in the comments below, because the past has a way of reaching forward into the present, and sometimes the hush isn't trapped in history. It's waiting right beside you. It's one of those eerie truths that fuels the most viral, creepy true stories and dark secrets whispered in corners of YouTube stories that leave viewers staring at their screens, pulse quickened, wondering how close they've come to glimpsing something they were never meant to see. And there exists a single piece of evidence, a fragile scrap of official record, that many historians still argue over preserved under the hesitant, trembling script of a county clerk, who, even as his pen scratched across the page, seemed to know he was capturing a piece of a real horror story that might never fit into polite conversation. It was a record buried deep among tax ledgers and land deeds, and yet it pulsed like a hidden vein of darkness through the dusty vaults, offering the smallest glimpse into the convent's hidden order. That record spoke of Hollow Creek in a way no priest or parishioner ever dared, hinting at a silence so complete it threatened to rip open the boundaries between the seen and the unseen. And here's where the question begins to claw at your certainty. What could compel 11 women, bound in faith, to sever themselves from every sacrament, every human connection, until they moved like shadows behind curtained windows, speaking no word even to God? Some modern researchers call Hollow Creek one of America's most unsolved mysteries, placing it on lists of haunted places you're not supposed to visit and disturbing secrets the church never wanted told. But while many tales get swept up in the digital noise of clickbait horror, the Hollow Creek record is different, because it's not folklore, it's documented. It exists, ink on paper, as undeniable as the chill creeping up your spine right now. The clerk's handwriting stumbles across the page, describing not just the convent, but the smell of tallow softening in winter heat, the pale color of wax like sweat, and the name scrawled at the bottom, Mother Lorette. A name that flickers like a dying candle in every investigation, appearing nowhere else in county or diocesan records, as though she stepped into this world only to sign that one order and then retreated into the hush forever. And even as historians pore over those few sentences, hoping to crack the silence they're left facing, the same unsettling possibility that there are truths so alien, so quietly monstrous, that no language can hold them without trembling apart. And perhaps the most terrifying part is this: that silence might not be Hollow Creek's alone, but something waiting beneath every quiet roof, just out of sight, pressing against the edges of your own reality. reminding you that sometimes the scariest thing isn't what screams in the night, but what whispers nothing at all. Sometimes the smallest details in history are the ones that fracture our certainty, because it's not always the bloody crimes or open graves that haunt us most, but the paper trails that whisper that something has been hidden in plain sight all along. So when historians stumbled across a single record tucked among the county's ancient ledgers, written in a hand that trembled as though the pen itself recoiled from the words, they realized they were looking at more than just an ordinary receipt. It was the winter of 1849, a season so cruel that rivers froze solid and livestock perished in the fields. And yet even in that desolation, something moved quietly in the shadows of Hollow Creek. For in that harsh season, the convent placed an order so enormous, it required 3 wagons to haul its weight across the snowbound roads, a consignment of wax, pale as sweet, exhaling a faint sour tang, like tallow gone soft with age. The number of pounds listed was staggering, so excessive that even the clerk's script seemed to stammer across the page. And at the bottom of that record sat a single name, Mother Lorette. A name absent from every other official ledger, from every baptismal registry, every diocesan log, as though she stepped into the world only long enough to sign her name and vanish back into the hush. And the question that lingers, pulsing like a second heartbeat behind the words, is the same one that fuels the most viral unsolved mysteries and dark secrets videos whispered across the internet today. Why would a convent of merely 11 women require hundreds of pounds of wax? What ritual, what purpose demanded such a staggering bounty of tallow, carried not by carts into ordinary storage, but lifted by hand into the sealed cellar beneath the chapel, a door bolted afterward and never opened again? Even among the modern wave of real horror stories and lists of haunted places you're not supposed to visit, this single detail remains one of the most confounding. For it suggests that what happened in Hollow Creek was no accident, no passing eccentricity of religious fervor, but a deliberate act, a disturbing secret hidden beneath the language of commerce and devotion. And if a single line in an old ledger can still make your breath hitch and your pulse quicken, it's because some truths refuse to stay buried, no matter how many decades of silence press down upon them. Modern researchers pore over these old records, hoping that if they read the words often enough, they might crack the code of Hollow Creek's hush. But the more they search, the more they're forced to reckon with a possibility that shatters the comfort of reality itself, that silence can be chosen with such absolute conviction that it becomes more unbreakable than any wall of stone, and that whatever secret sleeps beneath Hollow Creek's chapel, it might still be listening. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't what screams in the night, but what stands perfectly still in the daylight, silent and watching, as if holding back a truth too monstrous for the world to bear. That was the memory the Carters carried for the rest of their days, a memory that crawled behind their eyes and kept them awake long after the frost had melted from the roads leading to Hollow Creek. For when the wagons groaned to a halt within the convent's courtyard, the sisters emerged from the shadows, each moving with such precise unity that it seemed less like human motion and more like the shifting of pieces on a game board only they understood. They stood in a rigid row, heads bowed, every face hidden beneath layers of starched linen and wool, and each woman held a narrow strip of linen pressed tightly across her mouth as if containing a cry that might shatter stone walls if released. One of the men would later swear that he glimpsed a faint trembling in their shoulders, like a held breath on the edge of escape, and that in that frozen instant, he felt he was standing before a ritual that balanced on the knife edge between devotion and damnation. It's details like these that keep Hollow Creek alive on lists of unsolved mysteries whispered among those who seek out the world's dark secrets and real horror stories. Because what happened that day was not merely a transaction of goods, but a glimpse into a silence so absolute, it seemed to press outward like a living thing. As each crate was lifted from the wagons, the air thickened with the scent of old tallow, sharp and sweet, all at once clinging to the men's clothes, until they felt as though they carried the convent's hush back home with them. The abbess Mother Lorette gave no command aloud. Instead, she raised one pale hand and gestured toward the narrow stair that led beneath the chapel floor. The Carters obeyed, carrying the heavy boxes down into a darkness that felt closer with every step, a darkness so dense it seemed to drink the flicker of lantern flames. When the last crate disappeared below, the sisters remained perfectly still, linen still pressed to their lips, as if holding back words that could never be unspoken. Then, with a sound like iron striking stone, the cellar door slammed shut, the bolt thrown home in one final gesture that rang through the courtyard like a closing verdict. And from that day forward, no man ever saw that hidden chamber again. The men who carried the wax would spend the rest of their lives avoiding questions about that day, shrugging off inquiries with hollow laughter or muttered prayers. Yet in private moments they confessed that the memory clung to them, like the smell of tallow in their hair, reminding them that they had brushed against a place where faith and terror had become indistinguishable. Because sometimes the greatest horror is not that something monstrous waits in the dark, but that it stands in plain sight, silent, patient, and determined to stay unseen. And the hush that sealed the cellar door in Hollow Creek might be the same hush waiting in the shadows of places you think you know. There comes a moment in every dark story when rumor hardens into belief, when shadows become proof, and the hush you thought was harmless begins to claw at the edges of your sanity. And for Hollow Creek, that moment arrived when its silence bled into legend. Over the years, the convent became a name parents whispered into the ears of children who refused to sleep, a cautionary tale used to quiet restless limbs beneath quilts. They spoke of the sisters as if they were spirits instead of flesh and blood. Women who moved like ghosts behind curtained windows, never glimpsed except in the hour before dawn. And it was always dawn, that thin gray slice of time when the rumors claimed Hollow Creek revealed its true shape. Travelers who lost their way on the twisting roads swore they saw candlelight flickering behind the upper shutters of the convent, the glow of dozens of tapers casting trembling silhouettes onto the white plaster walls. But those shadows were wrong. They did not resemble women in prayer. Some witnesses insisted the figures knelt in postures too rigid, too twisted, as if their bones had been sculpted into shapes that defied any devotion known to the church. And that detail, the grotesque stillness of the silhouettes, sparked the same unsolved mystery theories that flood modern reels and shorts, feeding a hunger for dark secrets and forbidden places hidden from the light. People spoke of limbs bent at impossible angles, of spines curved like drawn bows, as though something had seized these women from within and reshaped their bodies in silent obedience to a law no priest could name. A drover who once passed by the convent gate confessed that as he watched those flickering shadows, he felt the sudden suffocating certainty that he was being observed in return, that countless eyes stared back at him from the other side of those narrow windows. And in that moment he understood true helplessness, a terror born of being utterly alone before something vast and unknowable. It was like the world had turned inside out, he whispered later, his voice trembling, and I realized I wasn't just watching them, they were waiting for me. Even today, paranormal investigators rank Hollow Creek among the real haunted places you should never visit alone, warning that its hush carries an echo powerful enough to unravel the mind. Because in the chill that hangs around those pale stone walls, there is a sense of menace coiled tight as a spring, a feeling that one step too close will trigger consequences no one can survive. And if the sisters were praying, the question that haunts every telling is this: to whom or to what were they praying? For in that hush lies the most terrifying possibility of all, that Hollow Creek isn't merely a ruin, haunted by past rituals, but a place where reality itself has been quietly rewritten, leaving visitors stranded in a truth that no faith or reason can explain. And the silence that clings to its stones is not empty. It's alive, waiting for the next soul reckless enough to listen. There's a special kind of terror that grows, not from what you see, but from what no one will explain, a terror that turns silence into a cage and leaves entire villages whispering the same desperate questions. So it was in Hollow Creek where the parish priest, once a figure of comfort, became the gatekeeper of dread. When villagers approached him, trembling, pleading to know what evil had taken root in the convent, he simply lowered his eyes and quoted scripture about the dangers of questioning God's chosen. But no matter how many psalms he recited, the questions refused to die. Why had the sisters withdrawn so completely from the sacraments? Why did they vanish from the village harvest, from the charity festivals, from the rituals that tied the faithful together like threads in a single tapestry? And most disturbing of all, why on certain cold evenings did the wind seem to carry a chorus of muffled voices, hoarse and rhythmic, as if struggling to speak through mouths bound shut? These weren't idle curiosities. They were the beating heart of the village's fear-fueling modern obsessions with unsolved mysteries and ranking Hollow Creek among America's most dark secrets. And the more the priest deflected those questions with scripture, the more certain people became that something monstrous lay hidden behind the convent's pale walls. Even the air seemed different around Hollow Creek. Travelers spoke of how it grew dense and heavy, pressing against the lungs, until each breath felt like inhaling secrets you were never meant to know. Farmhands working the fields nearby reported sudden chills that raced across their skin like invisible fingers. And when dusk fell, a hush would descend so absolute that even the cicadas ceased their song, as though the land itself were holding its breath. Some claimed to hear it, then the faint pulsing cadence of voices rising and falling, a stifled chant, too distorted to decipher yet somehow undeniably human. It was the kind of sound that etched itself into the marrow of your bones, leaving you certain you'd stumbled onto a piece of reality you were never meant to witness. It was like the wind was trying to tell us a secret, but it had no mouth to speak, whispered an old seamstress decades after her own encounter near the convent gates. And that's the cruelest part of the Hollow Creek legend, the feeling of utter helplessness, the certainty that even if you stood screaming at those pale stone walls, the silence would only stare back. It's why modern thrill-seekers flock to stories of real horror places and creepy legends, hoping to taste the adrenaline that comes from touching something forbidden. But what they don't understand is that Hollow Creek's terror isn't about gore or ghosts. It's about the horror of isolation so profound that it severs your voice from the world, leaving you trapped behind a hush that feels alive. And the priest's refusal to speak was the final confirmation that there are truths so dark they'd break even the faith sworn to guard them. Because sometimes the most dangerous secrets aren't hidden in shadows. They're hidden in silence, waiting for someone foolish enough to listen. Some places don't simply guard their secrets, they fight back against anyone who dares try to unlock them, as if the silence itself has grown claws. It was the thaw of early spring when 2 young priests from the seminary in Columbus were dispatched to Hollow Creek, tasked with the quiet mission of discovering why an entire convent had vanished behind stone walls and vows no bishop could explain. The journey was harsh, the roads half drowned in meltwater, the air smelling of thawed mud and distant wood smoke. As they drew closer, they found the convent looming against the pale sky, its white walls streaked with damp, its windows sealed tight as eyelids closed against a nightmare. No one came to greet them. The priests, still untested by the world's darker corners, knocked until their knuckles split, each hollow thud echoing into a courtyard so silent it felt alive. And in that hush, they began to feel the weight of every rumor, every whispered, unsolved mystery that surrounded Hollow Creek, a place increasingly spoken of in the same breath as the world's most dark secrets and forbidden places. When at last they turned to leave, driven by exhaustion and creeping dread, a smaller door within the great gate creaked open, just wide enough for a single figure to emerge. It was a woman, clad in the old-fashioned habit of the order, her shape thin as a candle's flame, her face hidden almost entirely behind a veil of starched linen. She raised one pale hand, a gesture hanging somewhere between benediction and warning, then lifted a small slate board upon which a single word had been scrawled in trembling chalk: leave. That one word carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken horrors. The younger priest tried to answer, but as he opened his mouth, his throat seized as though invisible fingers had closed around it, choking off every syllable. His eyes widened in shock as he clutched his own collar, breath stuttering in his chest. The older priest, his face gray with a fear he could not mask, seized the younger man's arm and hissed the single word that has haunted generations of readers of real horror stories ever since retreat. They backed away, step by careful step, their boots squelching in the sodden earth, never daring to turn their backs on the silent figure who watched them without moving. And then, with a final measured grace, she stepped back inside, and the door closed with a muffled click that seemed to swallow all sound. In that instant the hush returned, thick and absolute, as though no one had ever stood behind those gates at all. For the rest of their lives, neither priest would speak publicly of what they saw at Hollow Creek. The younger man was plagued by sleepless nights, certain that somewhere beyond the edge of waking, the nun's veiled face still waited, slate in hand, commanding silence. And even the elder priest, hardened by scripture and duty, could never again walk past a locked gate without feeling that the stones were listening. Because the terror of Hollow Creek was not merely in what it revealed, but in how quickly it erased every trace of those who dared to look. And in that silence was the chilling knowledge that whatever lurked inside those walls could reach out and strip a man of his voice, his purpose, and finally his place in the world. And that's why Hollow Creek still ranks among the world's most disturbing secrets, for it stands as a reminder that there are places so steeped in hush that they don't just hide the truth, they devour it whole. Every haunted legend has a moment where disbelief dies and terror becomes real, a moment so vivid it cracks open the walls of sanity and makes you question if the world you know has always been a lie. For Hollow Creek, that moment came in the shape of a woman named Emmeline Thorne, a traveling herbalist whose name would one day become a footnote in lists of America's most unsolved mysteries and creepy legends. She arrived one evening under a sky-streaked violet and ash, carrying a basket of tinctures and dried herbs, unaware that she was about to step into the heart of one of the country's most dark secrets. She paused at the convent's gate, expecting perhaps a simple barter or a word of greeting. But instead, she saw the sisters moving across the courtyard, in a line so precise, it was almost mechanical, each figure thin and straight as a wick of candlelight. Their habits rustled faintly, but no voices rose, no breath seemed to escape their lips. Then one sister broke away, drifting toward the ancient stone well at the courtyard's center. She worked the iron pump in silence, her hands pale as bone under the lantern's glow. As the bucket rose, Emmeline leaned forward, curiosity battling the growing knot of dread inside her chest. And that's when she saw it, a reflection in the black surface of the water. A face pale and slack, the mouth bound tight with a length of waxed cloth pressed so fiercely it hollowed the cheeks. For a fraction of a second their eyes locked, and Emmeline felt something rupture deep in her mind. Because in that woman's eyes shone not just fear, but a flicker of savage relief, or perhaps a warning so urgent it seemed to scream through the hush. It was as though that one silent gaze was trying to speak a truth too monstrous to bear, a truth that would shatter every certainty Emmeline had carried into that courtyard. It's moments like these that keep Hollow Creek alive on lists of real horror stories and disturbing secrets whispered across the dark corners of the internet. Before she could cry out, the figure turned and vanished into the shadows beneath the cloister arch, as though the stone itself had swallowed her whole. Emmeline stood frozen, the air sharp as knives, the hush around her suddenly pressing against her skull, like a hand determined to smother her thoughts. She fled the gates without looking back, the echo of her own heartbeat loud as drum beats in the silent night. No one believed her when she tried to tell them what she'd seen. They dismissed her story as delirium, the fantasies of a woman who had wandered too far from the safety of familiar roads. But those who heard her recount the tale really heard her, spoke of the way her voice would tremble, how her eyes darted toward corners no one else thought to look. Because they sensed the same thing Emmeline had glimpsed that night, that Hollow Creek wasn't just hiding secrets, it was crafting them, bending reality into new and terrible shapes. And in that single glimpse of wax-sealed silence, Emmeline saw the ultimate horror, that devotion could transform flesh into something no longer quite human, and that the hush behind those convent walls was not merely silence, it was a prison built to keep something unspeakable from ever slipping free. There's a line every institution dreads to cross, where the rules of man collapse under the weight of something older, darker, and utterly beyond negotiation, and in 1856, the church found itself standing on that line, staring into the void that was Hollow Creek. By that year, even the bishopric, normally unmoved by rumor, grew restless under the constant drip of stories leaking from the convent's high stone walls. Reports trickled in like poison into clear water, carried by trembling farmers and frightened traders who whispered of candlelit shapes that didn't move, like women of wind that howled with muffled voices, and of a silence that felt heavy enough to crush the skull. So an inquiry was drafted, an official's sober attempt to pierce the hush. But no one stepped forward to carry it out. No priest, no deacon, no clerical scribe would volunteer to enter Hollow Creek. It was as if the entire diocese recoiled from the task the same way flesh recoils from an open flame. And so letters were dispatched instead, sealed with bright crimson wax stamped with the diocesan crest, each carrying an entreaty for explanation, a plea for the sisters to answer for the darkness gathering around their name. Yet every letter came back untouched, the wax seals unbroken, the paper unsmudged, and in the corner the convent's name and address crossed out in ink darker than dried blood. It was the kind of detail that fuels unsolved mysteries and lands Hollow Creek among the world's most whispered dark secrets. And when the bishop's secretary finally pressed a young courier into delivering one last summons by hand, The boy returned trembling so violently that the bishop feared he'd been struck with fever. He refused to look anyone in the eye, his face the color of old parchment. In his palm, he held a single scrap of linen brittle, as dried leaves on which a single phrase had been stitched over and over in jagged thread, "We have spoken our last." And that was the moment, the pivot point, when belief in reason and faith began to fracture like thin ice beneath a heavy boot. Because what kind of vow is so absolute that it rejects even the Church's highest authority? What truth could demand silence so total that it erases not only speech, but the very willingness to explain? From that day forward, no more letters were sent. The convent was left untouched, a dark wound on the parish records, the edges of its stone walls growing more streaked and pitted as each season passed. Yet the hush surrounding it only grew denser, becoming less rumor and more oppressive fact. And that is why modern researchers in countless videos, titled Real Horror Stories and Disturbing Secrets, still obsess over Hollow Creek, for in those words, "We have spoken our last," lies a horror deeper than any haunting. It's the horror of knowing there are truths so monstrous that even God's own emissaries cannot bear to speak them aloud. And that perhaps the worst terror isn't that monsters wait in the shadows, but that human devotion can become so absolute it ceases to recognize any authority but the silence itself. There's a particular cruelty in the way Hollow Creek chose to reveal itself, not through open violence or blood, but through quiet glimpses that shattered the minds of those who happened to look too long. In the years after the bishop's final silence, the Sisters of Hollow Creek were seen only during the deepest freezes, when the trees stood stripped and the roads hardened into ruts of frozen clay. It was as though the convent chose the moments when nature itself seemed brittle, more breakable, to allow its secrets to slip into view. It was during one such winter that Samuel Keene, a farmhand with calloused hands and a simple faith, found himself staring into a truth that would forever divide his life into before and after. He was tending his fence line under a sky heavy with snow when he saw them crossing the convent yard, 11 women moving in single file, each carrying a slender bundle wrapped in white muslin. Their heads were bowed, not against any visible wind, but as if shielding themselves from an invisible force pressing down upon them. Samuel froze, watching as they passed through the courtyard and vanished into the chapel. When the door closed behind them, it made a sound like a coffin lid settling, sealing something alive into darkness. And even though every instinct screamed at him to walk away, Samuel couldn't. That night, sleep eluded him. A pressure sat on his chest, like unseen hands holding him to his bed, whispering that the silence at Hollow Creek was not the absence of sound, but the weight of words too terrible to be spoken. He rose from his pallet, the frost crunching beneath his boots, and found himself drawn to the convent wall as though tethered by a string wound tight around his ribs. Pressing his ear to the cold stone, he expected perhaps the distant hush of prayer. Instead, he heard a rhythm, a soft halting pulse like chanting forced through throats bound tight. It was fragmented, broken, as though each syllable was being torn through a barrier no human voice was meant to cross. Samuel staggered back, bile rising in his throat, because in that moment he realized that whatever lay behind those walls was not prayer. It was a ritual that scraped the edges of faith and fell screaming into something older, something that demanded not devotion, but transformation. It's revelations like this that drive Hollow Creek into modern lists of real horror stories and unsolved mysteries, whispered across forums obsessed with disturbing secrets and dark rituals. Samuel never spoke of what he heard. When pressed, he would only shake his head, eyes clouded like winter skies, and mutter that whatever faith compels such rituals is not meant for any other to witness. And that's the true terror. Hollow Creek holds the certainty that some truths are not hidden because they're false, but because they are too real, too monstrous, too certain to fit inside the fragile walls of the human mind. And that perhaps the deepest horror isn't what waits behind the convent's doors, but how quickly your own beliefs crumble once you hear it breathing in the dark. Sometimes the ground itself betrays the secrets it's been forced to hold. And in Hollow Creek, the thaw of 1859 was the moment the earth tried to speak. That spring came late, stubborn, as an unspoken sin, leaving the fields locked under frost weeks past their time. But when the first trickle of meltwater finally seeped beneath the convent gates, winding like a slender vein through the rutted road before vanishing into the ditch, the villagers felt something tighten around their hearts. They called it an omen, though no two souls could agree on what doom or deliverance it foretold. And that's when Hannah Doyle began to dream. She was a seamstress by trade, a woman whose days were measured in neat stitches, and whose nights were once untroubled by anything more than the rustle of the wind. But in the dark hours following the thaw, she found herself carried into visions that felt less like dreams and more like memories borrowed from some hidden history. In her vision, she stood inside the convent chapel, the air close and heavy as melted wax. Before her knelt 11 nuns, shoulder to shoulder, each one draped in habits white as bone. Their lips were stitched shut with waxed thread so perfectly bound that the wax seemed to pulse with every ragged breath. And in each sister's trembling hands burned a slender taper, the hot wax spilling over pale skin, running in molten rivulets across knuckles and wrists. Yet not a sound rose from them, not even the hiss of flesh meeting flame. It was an act of devotion so profound, it twisted itself into violence, a ritual of self-anointing where pain became prayer. And it's visions like this that earn Hollow Creek a place on countless lists of real horror stories, unsolved mysteries and modern channels eager to uncover dark secrets left behind by forgotten centuries. When Hannah awoke, her throat felt scorched raw, as if she'd screamed herself hoarse in her sleep. But she couldn't remember uttering a single word. Instead, she carried a single fragment of the dream back into daylight, a shape of a word soft as a prayer and cold as meltwater sliding under the convent's ancient stones. But try as she might, she could not recall what that word had been. And those who listened to her account were left shaken, because they knew Hollow Creek's true horror was never merely in its silence, but in how close it always seemed to pushing into the waking world. It's why the story has endured as one of America's most chilling creepy legends, because it suggests that faith once twisted can birth rituals so stark they strip the soul of speech itself. Some dismissed Hannah's nightmare as the feverish result of too many stories whispered in candlelight. Yet others, especially those who'd heard the wind murmur like sealed mouths, believed she'd glimpsed something real. Because in Hollow Creek, the boundary between dream and revelation is razor thin, and sometimes the only thing holding reality together is the hush that waits behind every locked door. And perhaps the most chilling truth of all is this, that the silence behind those convent walls is not merely the absence of sound, but the burial ground for words too dangerous to name. Some stories don't end. They simply sink deeper into the earth, waiting for the right breath of wind, the right hush of silence to rise again, and Hollow Creek has always been one of those stories. Beyond Margaret's haunted account, the convent's decline continued with a kind of dreadful quiet, as though even decay itself tread lightly around those walls. The township that once listed the sisters on its parish rolls, emptied out farmhouses, surrendered to thistle and sedge roads, dissolving back into the mud from which they'd been carved. No official claim was ever laid upon the convent. No bishop declared it holy ground, nor did any government record it as abandoned property. It simply slipped out of the world's legal grasp, becoming something less like a building, and more like a presence and idea that refused to die. And that refusal became its own unsolved mystery, ensuring Hollow Creek's place among the most persistent dark secrets whispered in forums obsessed with real horror stories. For even as decades passed, the convent refused to crumble like ordinary stone. Its whitewashed walls remained upright, refusing the sag that time demanded of all things built by mortal hands. By 1891, a surveyor sent to chart the deserted land arrived with compass and ledger, expecting to find a ruin fit to be swallowed by the earth. But what he found instead defied both logic and time. The roof was whole. The window panes were unbroken. The fieldstone foundation sat square and true, untouched by the shifts that had splintered every other building of its age. He wrote in his notes, trembling with an honesty rare in official documents, that he suspected the convent was held together not by mortar and lime, but by a kind of collective intention, a will so fierce it had settled into the very bones of the stone. And that's the true horror of Hollow Creek, the reason it keeps surfacing on lists of creepy legends and haunted places you shouldn't visit alone. Because it suggests a possibility far more terrifying than ghosts or curses, that human faith, when twisted into absolute silence, can become so powerful it alters the laws of the physical world. Imagine a hush so dense it props up walls, keeps windows from shattering, and anchors a building in place even as the land around it decays. It's why Hollow Creek haunts the edges of every story about faith gone too far. Why the mere mention of it leaves listeners glancing over their shoulders, listening for the whisper of waxed threads scraping across lips. For in that silent convent lies the dreadful truth that some devotions don't die with the bodies who swore them. They remain pulsing like a second heart inside cold stone, waiting for someone foolish enough to knock on the door again. And that's why, even as the fields grow wild and the roads vanish under weeds, Hollow Creek endures not just as a place, but as a hush so potent it echoes through every generation that dares to remember its name. True horror doesn't fade when the sun rises. It lingers, etched into the edges of dawn, waiting to remind you that some shadows never truly lift. And so, it was with Hollow Creek, whose legends refused to die, even as time rolled forward, and new generations tried to bury old fears. Those who passed along the road toward distant towns could not help but glance sideways when they neared the convent. For in the hour before dawn, something impossible stirred behind those shuttered walls. The chapel glowed not with fire or lantern light, but with a soft, unwavering luminance, as though the flames of every candle ever burned inside it had left a permanent residue, a spectral afterimage no darkness could swallow. There was no smoke curling from the chimney, no rustle of robes or hush of slippered feet across the stone. Yet somehow the glass panes gleamed like polished amber, casting thin gold stripes across the frost-rimmed courtyard. And it's visions like this that keep Hollow Creek firmly lodged in lists of unsolved mysteries and haunted places you should never visit alone. A testament to the notion that some buildings are not merely haunted by spirits, but by memory itself. Children of the next generation learned to keep to the far side of the road, crossing themselves as they passed, afraid to look too closely for fear they might glimpse something moving behind the glass. Parents warned them not to linger, whispering that even the glow of that chapel was dangerous, as though staring too long might pull you into the hush that lay coiled inside those walls. Because in Hollow Creek, the terror was never about monsters clawing through the night. It was about the quiet certainty that devotion once twisted could become an entity of its own, refusing to die, even after the bodies that birthed it had long since turned to dust. There's a reason modern channels and reels still pour over images of the convent, titling their episodes "Real Horror Stories That Defy Explanation" or "The Most Disturbing Secrets Hidden in America's Forgotten Places." It's because Hollow Creek offers a horror so much deeper than jump scares or blood. It suggests that faith once corrupted might become a force capable of rewriting reality, leaving behind lights that shine where no flame burns, and silences that press like a physical weight against the chest. And that is why even in the present day, the road that skirts Hollow Creek remains worn by detours and cautious travelers. Because the true curse of that place isn't simply what happened within its stone walls, but how the hush it birthed continues to ripple outward, touching every life that dares to wander too near. And the glow behind those chapel windows stands as an eternal reminder that some lights are not meant to guide you home, they're meant to keep you away. There's a point where silence stops being emptiness and becomes a presence that breathes against your skin, reminding you that even the hush can be alive. For the postmaster who rode his mail route through Hollow Creek, that realization struck like an icy blade in the hour before dawn. It was winter, the world brittle with frost, the roads echoing beneath his horse's hooves, as though every step threatened to crack the earth itself. He'd passed the convent many times before, always quickening his pace when he glimpsed the white walls rising like bones out of the darkness. But on this morning something changed. As he approached, he saw the chapel ablaze with dozens of candles, each one burning tall and perfect, their flames so unnaturally still they might have been painted onto the air. No flicker, no smoke, not even a tremor as the icy drafts slipped through gaps in the wooden shutters. And in that frozen silence, he heard something far worse than whispers, or chanting, a soft rhythmic pressure that seemed to expand and contract around him, as though the entire building was inhaling. It was the sound of lungs that never tired, never paused, a hush so perfectly measured it felt less like breath and more like a heartbeat pulsing through stone. And that's the terror that keeps Hollow Creek alive in the world's most obsessive lists of unsolved mysteries, dark secrets, and real horror stories that defy explanation. Because it suggests a truth that twists the mind, that the convent didn't merely house secrets, it had become a living thing. Its silence transformed into a kind of respiration that reached out to touch any soul who dared draw near. The postmaster would later confess that he felt as if the building was listening to him, cataloging the rhythm of his own breath and waiting for a moment to synchronize his pulse with its own. And even when he finally spurred his horse away, the hush followed him, pressing against the back of his skull, like the memory of a voice trying to speak, but locked behind sealed lips. Because that's the deepest horror of Hollow Creek, that the hush has learned how to cling, how to echo in the minds of those who glimpse it, a contagion of silence that spreads unseen. Children in nearby villages grew up with strict instructions, never to look too long at the convent windows, for fear the glow would trap them, bind their tongues with invisible wax, and leave them standing forever in the dark. And so the postmaster's account became another layer of the legend, feeding modern reels and channels eager to document the most disturbing secrets hidden in forgotten places. For even today, people wonder if Hollow Creek still breathes, waiting for the next passerby to mistake stillness for safety. And the worst part is knowing that once you've heard that soft, tireless exhalation, some part of you will always be listening for it again in the dark, in the hush in space where words dare not go. Sometimes it takes only one curious soul to break the hush and discover that some silences aren't empty, but crowded with the weight of everything they've been forced to hide. Margaret Hallowed was precisely that kind of soul. A school teacher by profession, but a seeker by nature, she'd spent years haunted by the stories of vanished communities and the hollow spaces they left behind. By the spring of 1884, her curiosity burned hotter than caution. Hollow Creek had become her obsession, a riddle pulsing at the edge of America's most whispered unsolved mysteries. Armed with a small leather journal and a conviction that knowledge was worth any risk, she set out alone, determined to record every scrap of relic or document the convent might have left behind. As she approached, she saw that the road leading to the gates was choked with bramble and thistle, the wheel ruts so shallow they seemed less like pathways and more like scars left on the earth's skin. The silence around her was so complete it felt physical, pressing against her ears until the thud of her own heartbeat sounded monstrous. When she dismounted and stepped closer, the air changed. A chill swept across her face, carrying a smell she struggled to name, something both sweet and rancid, like overripe fruit left to ferment in the dark corners of a cellar. It was an odor that hinted at secrets rotting behind stone walls, secrets desperate to seep into the world beyond. Margaret wrote in her journal of how her hand trembled as she reached for the gate latch, convinced it would be locked tight as every other secret the convent had guarded for generations. But when she pressed her palm against it, the iron gave way, the latch yielding like softened wax, and the gate swung inward on hinges so silent it felt as though the air itself was holding its breath. And it's moments like this that fuel modern channels eager to expose real horror stories and disturbing secrets from America's forgotten past. Because Margaret's account proves a truth that chills the bone, that the real terror of Hollow Creek isn't just what hides inside, but how willingly it seems to invite the next witness closer. To this day, researchers comb through her entries, analyzing every detail for hidden meaning, convinced she stumbled into a hush so profound, it still echoes in the present. And though her words remain calm on the page, those who read them closely say they feel something else lurking beneath each carefully chosen sentence, a pulse of dread that suggests she saw far more than she ever dared record. Because that's how Hollow Creek traps you, not with screams or apparitions, but with the quiet, irresistible lure of knowing that if you just step 1 inch further, you might glimpse the truth. And once you glimpse it, nothing you ever believed feels safe again. And so Margaret's footsteps linger in the hush, a reminder that sometimes the most haunted places are not the ones full of ghosts, but the ones that simply won't let silence die. In a world that demands everything be named, explained, and dissected, the hush behind Hollow Creek's walls remains the rarest defiance, a silence so deep it dares you to wonder if some truths are simply not meant for human minds. And maybe that's why this story lingers like cold breath on the back of your neck, because it whispers a question you can't quite silence. What would you choose to speak, or to keep the kind of secret that reshapes reality itself? For those who have glimpsed Hollow Creek, the answer has always come at a price, the weight of knowledge pressing like stone on the chest, and the gnawing fear that silence can be alive listening. But perhaps there's a strange comfort in knowing that even the darkest secrets don't always demand your voice. Sometimes survival lies in recognizing the hush for what it is, a boundary you were never meant to cross. And the deepest terror is not merely what waits behind locked doors, but how easily devotion once twisted can become a force strong enough to warp the very bones of the world. If this story has left your pulse quickened, your thoughts racing through every forgotten corridor, then you're not alone. Drop a comment below, and tell me, do you think the sisters chose freedom in silence, or prison? Would you dare step through Hollow Creek's gates? And if you crave more real horror stories, unsolved mysteries, and tales of dark secrets that slip through the cracks of history, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss what waits in the shadows. Save this video to revisit the hush whenever the world feels too loud. Because some echoes deserve to be heard, and some silences remind us that mystery is the only proof we're still alive.